Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. We'll be opening this session, the third SPF Security Seminar under the auspices of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, very soon. The streaming will start very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this webinar hosted by Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We appreciate your kind attendance today. We have some announcements before we start this session. The moderator will be served by Mr. Yamaguchi, who is the visiting fellow of Sasakawa Peace Foundation. I look forward to your kind cooperation. Then we'd like to start the third security seminar entitled The Japanese Response to the Taiwan Crisis, How to Prepare and Respond under the auspices of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, International Peace and Security Department. I would like to invite the Executive Director of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Ms. Chano, to talk about the backdrop of discussions on why we have come to host this seminar. The Executive Director, Ms. Chano, please. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at the third SPF Security Seminar on the topic of the Japanese response to a Taiwan crisis, how to prepare and respond. I would like to thank Dr. Matsuda and Dr. Nagashima for joining us as the speakers for this seminar out of their busy schedule. Allow me to say a few words on behalf of the organizer. One of the emphasis at the International Peace and Security Department, which is the host of the seminar, is security in Indo-Pacific. The operation of the department involves analysis of Japanese defense policy, Japanese defense diplomacy and trade in China, as well as strategic dialogue between Japan, India, and Russia. Also through our satellite site entitled IINA, or International Information Network Analysis, or IINA for short, we also publish analysis by experts and carry out important communication to facilitate understanding about the security environment that surrounds Japan. Now, the international relations in Indo-Pacific surrounding Japan is faced with increasing tensions as U.S. and China adopt ever more confrontational approach. In the G7 leaders' communique, which was announced last month, issues such as stability of the Taiwan Strait and human rights in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and Hong Kong were clearly mentioned. You are aware that China has demonstrated its strong objection through their communication and demonstrative military actions. It has been some time since China has become a major economic and military power, and as the frictions with neighboring countries increase, the structure of conflict between U.S. and China has become more or less fixed, and Japan is placed at the geopolitical forefront against that backdrop. The Taiwan crisis, which is the theme of today's seminar, is one of the issues out of all issues related to China that has direct impact on Japan's security. As China has clarified its intention of being prepared to exercise military force for the reunification of Taiwan, comments made by former commander of Indo-Pacific Command, Commander Philip Davidson, during a U.S. congressional hearing that Chinese invasion of Taiwan could happen in the next 6 years caught people's attention. Developing a system for readiness of Japan against such a crisis is an urgent issue. Under those circumstances, clarifying points of discussion related to Japanese response to crisis and studying how to respond to crisis is urgently needed to strengthen deterrence and prevent such crisis and to respond in a realistic manner. At the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, we believe that we should have constructive discussion to come up with a solution is required. Today we have with us experts of security as well as issues related to Taiwan. And also, as I mentioned earlier, these experts are active participants to IINA as panelists today. These panelists, on top of their academic know-how, have very rich practical experience. And I'm sure that they will provide insight into how Japan can respond in a realistic manner. I do hope that today's seminar will help to promote deepening of discussion on Taiwan Strait's crisis in Japan and will contribute to the security of Indo-Pacific in broad terms. And with this, I would like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, the Executive Director, Ms. Chino. We'd now like to start the session. Allow me to introduce the speakers in the order of their presentation. I will ask them to speak roughly between 10 to 15 minutes each. And then after their respective presentations, we would like to have a panel discussion inclusive of the moderator. And we would like to set aside 15 minutes at the end of the session for Q&A session so that we'll be able to accommodate questions to those of you who are taking part in the webinar. We'd also like to receive your comments as well. Also, with regard to questions from the participants, please use the chat function on the screen of the YouTube. You'll also be able to enter your comment as well. Please enter your name and affiliation when you do enter your comment or your question. So first, I would like to introduce our first speaker. It's Professor Yasuhiro Matsuda, who is the professor at the University of Tokyo Interfaculty Initiatives in Information Studies. He is an expert in international politics in East Asia, and he has been watching Taiwan and China over many years. He is indeed the foremost authority when it comes to the Straits relations. He has also worked at the National Institute in Defense Studies as well, and he's deeply versed in international security issues as well. He will focus on the current situation and outlook pertaining to relations between Taiwan and China, and he will also provide us with analysis about the situation pertaining to Taiwan Strait from his perspective. We look forward to his insight. The next speaker is the Senior Visiting Fellow of the Sasakawa Foundation International Peace and Security Department, and Dr. Tsuneo Watanabe. Dr. Watanabe has spent 10 years at the Washington think tank, CSIS, and he has followed U.S. foreign policy as well as security as his field of expertise. Today, he will talk about the U.S. commitment to Taiwan under the Biden administration. We look forward to his report on this topic. He will also focus on U.S.-China relations and also U.S.-Taiwan relations as well. Next, we have with us Dr. Jun Nagashima. He hails from Air Self-Defense Force. He was a defense attaché in Belgium. He was a NATO coordinator, and he's internationally active in this field. He's the first uniformed officer to serve as the counselor to the National Security Secretariat as the counselor. Currently, he is teaching at the National Defense Academy. He will provide us with military perspective on the situation pertaining to Taiwan Strait. We look forward to your insight. Thank you so much, Dr. Nagashima. Last but not least, with us, Dr. Susumu Nakamura, who is the Senior Visiting Fellow at Sasakawa Peace Foundation. He has studied a legal framework of defense at the Maritime Self-Defense Force, and he will give us legal perspective as to what Japanese government needs to do in terms of policy against the crisis in Taiwan Straits. And without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Matsuda for his presentation. Dr. Matsuda, please.
Hello, I am Matsuda. I prepared the slides for you. I hope it's up on the screen. The situation in between peaceful unification policy and the use of force. Of course, whether war would happen or not depend on the economic, social situation of that particular region. So I would like to just offer to you the basic food for thought today. This is the 3 points I would like to cover today. There is a dilemma between self-reliance and prosperity pressing the changes in status quo, which is occurring in Taiwan. And against that situation, what will be the strategic changes that Xi Jinping will be making? And lastly, we will think about the likelihood of the use of force or forced peaceful unification. I would like to take a look at the society in thinking about these things. Now let's think about the current situation of Taiwan. To start with, of course, China wants to unify Taiwan, but currently it's hard to do. That is the current situation. For the past 20-year period, big changes had occurred. which is China's economic rise. I would like to refer to the military rise later, so I would focus on economy first. The economic situation of China changed greatly. Please look at the next slide. Left-hand side top. You can see the US, China, and Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan GDP numbers. From 1996, that was the time of Taiwan Strait crisis, which is on the vertical line, and it started to rise. This is a graph of China. With 4:1, that used to be the ratio of China's GDP against Taiwan, but now it's 23 or 24. Now please look at the right-hand side below. You can see the dependency of trade between China and Taiwan. Blue is Taiwan's dependency on China. You can see the straight line back in 2007, the birth of Ma Ying-jeou government. Then the stability came on since that time. So basically during the 2000, rapidly, Taiwan started to depend so much on China. Now please look at the left-hand side below, which shows Taiwan's trade value vis-a-vis US, China, and Japan. Please look at the down below rectangle. So they are making money by exporting to the United States. That is a situation of Taiwan, and also making big imports from Japan. So Taiwan always have had a big trade deficit vis-a-vis Japan. That is a long-term trend. So always what to do about the trade deficit between Taiwan and Japan has been the standing issue. But nowadays, exports over Taiwan to China had increased. There is a factory there, and the components are being exported, being assembled on mainland, and it's re-exported to the United States. So that nowadays it's contributing to the imbalance of trade between US and China. And China is making a lot of money vis-a-vis United States. So for the past 20-year period, Taiwan needs to go to Shanghai and said that no way Taiwan can beat Shanghai, that much growth on the part of China. Please look at the right-hand side top. The per capita GDP, US, Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, and China, in this order. So in terms of per capita GDP, by far China is Taiwan's number is big, but otherwise Chinese economy had grew so much ever since 2008. You can see the changes that occurred. So simply put, I only have short time. So right-hand side top, please. Are you Chinese or Taiwanese? If you ask that question in the survey, then I'm a Taiwanese, not a Chinese. It's shown in blue. It's on the rise over long term. If you look at the left-hand side, this is the missile fired time. And at the middle, on the left-hand side top, you can see so lots of tourists came. Social contact increased, and at which time Taiwanese said that we are Taiwanese, not the Chinese. That kind of identity grew strong. And please look at the right-hand side top, the extreme right-hand side box. For the past 2 years or so, a larger number of people started to claim themselves to be a Taiwanese, not the Chinese, because of the pandemic and the Hong Kong situation. Image on China had worsened very much. So Taiwanese will never identify themselves with China. At the same time, in Taiwan, as far as the pandemic actions are concerned, it's been respectable, very proud, something to be proud of. So if you look at the party affiliation, this is the DPP, green, then their support rate went up very much over a 2-year period. Please look at right-hand side bottom. Well, basically in Taiwan, in choosing the state, most of the people prefer the status quo. In future, maybe some people would like to unification or independent. And there has been a sudden change over the past 2-year period or so that people would like to become independent and so forth. So would the Taiwan people like to go to China? It was back in 2018, it peaked, but for the past 2-year period, it went down very much. Left-hand side though, look at President Tsai's support and so forth policies in Taiwan. There are so many people, 70% of Taiwanese support the Hong Kong democratization campaign. And KMT's stance was very ambivalent, but Madam Tsai's government was very clear, so she had gained much more support. And you can see right-hand side bottom the responses to whether Chinese government is a friend of Taiwanese or not. So in Taiwan, DPP's government is prolonged. For China, when it comes to policy vis-a-vis Taiwan, they would like to have a peaceful unification. By having a negotiation with KMT, they are seeking to have a unification, but the premise is now crumbling in front of the China's eyes. So simply put, I would say that Xi Jinping is now reversed strategy from my Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping wanted a stable, the U.S.-China relationship open and reform and stay hydro strength, keep a low profile and omnidirectional diplomacy, assuring people concerned, and they took it as a package, but because of Tiananmen incident, it crumbled. The political reform have been aborted. Then came the Xi Jinping government, who had reversed this strategy, strengthened the autocracy and the centralization, seeking the strong army-rich country. It has become a structuralized confrontation between U.S. and China, and high-handed wolf warrior diplomacy is being carried out, and the forced ending of one country, two system of Hong Kong, weaponization of economic measures, and so forth. So peaceful unification is impossible, hard to do. So forced peaceful unification might be the way. If you don't listen, then force will be used to the counterparty. And the best would be that without producing any victim, forcefully peaceful unification will take place. That is the best scenario. It is said under the rubric of peaceful unification, but the work is underway. So what will be the case? Let's think about the likelihood of unification by force. There are so many ways that one can use force. The unification by force is the hardest hurdle. One cannot afford to lose, which means that the whole island will be occupied, and a new government will be launched, and the rule will begin, and it will be maintained throughout the Taiwan Strait. The supply line need to be kept. It's very highly costly, risk is high, because the U.S. might intervene on the halfway through, then this plan might crumble. So with regard to these capabilities, China doesn't have a long-term confidence in consummating this job. What about space and cyber? However, capability would be high on China. That is not enough, because Chinese forces have to land on Taiwanese territory, and maybe blockage can be done by the U.S. military on the Taiwan Straits. Then it would make China very difficult to achieve the objective. So on the part of China, the capability is low, and they don't like to do it. Basically, they are looking for forced peaceful unification. What about the likelihood of limited use of force? About 4 scenarios. A is Pratas Island and Taiping Island. This is the outrage of Taiwanese. So if it is taken away, nothing can be done about it. And U.S. has no responsibility to take this back for Taiwan. B is Ichimen and Matsu. It's been fortified. So counterattack will come. Amoy and so forth, much damage will be done on the mainland. And there are people who are anti-Taiwan independence. So no reason for attacking the region in the first place. And next is Penghu Island. It's a part of Taiwan. In Taiwan relations law, it's a part of Taiwan. So if Penghu Islands are taken away, it will be a very difficult situation. It is within the range. So Taiwan would fight back fiercely to take this back. And next is the limited attack on the Taiwan territory. The economy can be decimated and destroyed, but territory cannot be taken. In case of a perfect war, then it is a scenario A case. But what is a common feature throughout those four different scenarios is what would happen afterwards, what would be the reaction of Taiwan. No one knows what would be the end, how far it will go, no one knows. So for Japan, or for China, that is, what they're doing is to waging a psychological war. In terms of military, that is the current situation of China. Because you might take some action, but it may not mean anything afterwards. And of course, China thinks that Pratas Island can be taken away by China easily. So pressure can be easily applied by China on this island for Taiwan. But if the Pratas Island is really taken, then in the South China Sea, status quo is changed. What is the implications on relations with ASEAN and Asian countries? The economic impact will be large on China. And Taiwan's sense of crisis goes up. Stronger assistance coming from United States and from Japan as well. So maybe outpost was taken away, but you cannot take the main points. So that is the situation. The psychological warfare is being waged. But the problem is accidental clash. That is a problem because it is occurring now. So far it has been settled by diplomatic efforts or managed in that way so far. So U.S. might abandon Taiwan, no functioning of Japan-U.S. alliance, no rebellion from Taiwan, and this is a condition for use of force. So if those three conditions are met, it will be terrible. So efforts should be made not to have these conditions to be met. And don't let China think that they can do whatever they like. So don't let China have a use of force or forced peaceful unification. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matsuda, for that presentation. You talked about the broad picture pertaining to China-Taiwan relations. In particular, you focused on the changes of the awareness on the part of the Taiwanese public. I think that was a very positive presentation. Next, I'd like to go on to presentation from a U.S. perspective. Dr. Watanabe, please.
Thank you. About the U.S.-China relations and think about Taiwan in that context. So this is something I would like to say. As for the U.S.-China relations, it's bad, so that is why it's not good for Taiwan. It's like a chicken and egg story because the situation of Taiwan is critical. The relationship between U.S. and China might go all right. But anyway, the situation is getting tense. But how much commitment the Biden administration has over Taiwan is something that we have to look at. So we can focus on the differences and the continuity between Trump government and the Biden government. Under Trump government, State Secretary Pompeo made a speech at the 2020 last year, July, in Nixon Library. said that the engagement policy since Nixon's visit to China in 1972 was a failure. This is an engagement policy which replaced the containment policy of Cold War, acknowledged China's development, deepen economic relations, engage China in international society, and hopefully China will respect international rules and democratization value, but it didn't work out. Americans think that way. And the Biden administration also continues in this line of thinking. Central figure of foreign and security policy is Jake Sullivan, Presidential Security Advisor, and also Kurt Campbell, Coordinator on Indo-Pacific of NSC. And they made a contribution to the foreign affairs back in 2019. The article said that U.S.-China's engagement policy was a failure because they wanted to change the political and social and economic system of China, but it didn't work out that way. That is the gist of the paper. So between Trump and Biden, there is a commonality here. What is the difference then? One difference is that during the Trump administration, they had the America First belittled international cooperation, didn't make a good relationship with Europe. But the Biden administration emphasizes international cooperation. Look at the recent G7. Europe would like to also see the stability in the Taiwan Strait, although it is far away geopolitically, but Europeans would like to cooperate with the United States. That is the main thing. And those who used to work for Obama administration, working for the Biden administration, saying that Biden might be too lax on China. But there was a G2 theory saying that China and U.S. can decide many things about the world. But, of course, there are some hardline stance taken by Biden vis-à-vis China in addition to being lax. And for Biden administration, the China's suppression of democratization of Hong Kong government and the pressure on democracy functioning on Taiwan are extremely important issue for gaining support for U.S. leadership from Americans and allies. Because U.S. would like to regain their leadership in the world, and they emphasize the importance. It is related to the domestic issue. The Trump administration, and many voters think that it was Trump who won the presidential election, and there was a raid on the U.S. Congress on the January the 6th. So Biden administration would like to get the support from the Americans as well. So when Taiwan cannot be defended due to the weakness of the United States, then damage to U.S. position in the world domestically is incalculable. That is the thinking of Biden administration so far. As far as the Taiwan issue is concerned, unnecessarily stimulating China would raise risk. That's what U.S. people have believed. But recently, China is much more assertive. So it will be much more riskier for the United States to be ambiguous about China. The most famous article appeared in the Foreign Affairs. Richard Haas, chairman of Council on Foreign Affairs, wrote an article with David Sachs, research fellow of the Council, and wrote that U.S. strategy ambiguity on making determined intervention in Taiwan affair or not will make a deterrence. That U.S. has to have a strategic clarity, and U.S. would respond to any Chinese use of force against Taiwan. They haven't said that yet, but this is a recommendation made by that article, and U.S. is moving toward that direction. But there is a caveat here that it is consistent with the One China policy and minimize the risk of U.S.-China relations. That is the gist of the article, and that's the flow we can identify in Washington. And also, if you look at the latest China feature in the Foreign Affairs, Mastro also wrote an article. In the final analysis, Chinese leadership, whether they can imagine a victory over Taiwan Strait or not, everything has to be done in order not to have Chinese leadership picture that victory. We heard from Mr. Matsuda. So USA calculating the would be reaction from the China and trying not to lower the hurdle for deterrence and raise the hurdle for deterrence. And lastly, I would like to mention that what about Japan-US alliance? What is the expectation Japan has? The Jeffrey Horner of Rand Institute made a comment to Asahi newspaper. Horner used to work as a fellow at the U.S. Sasakawa Peace Foundation, and he's been studying here in Japan as well. We know him very well. So U.S. Minimum request is to seek the use of a U.S. base in Japan to execute the combat operations in Taiwan and its surrounding areas. And over the real area in non-combat task, U.S. may seek SDF logistics support in Japanese territory. So it's not that the U.S. are seeking SDFs jointly engage in combat operations or not. They are not seeking that. But if the situation worsens, then not the exercising of the right to collect and defense, but if it involves Japanese territory and the defense, then of course it will be a totally different story and context, because it pertains to the direct security protection of Japan. I know you know this very well about the international opinion. U.S. knows this very much. Nikkei done a survey from April 23rd to 25th, 50% positive on the first summit, negative 32%. And for the stability of Taiwan Strait, we should support 74% and opposition 13%. So they know about these findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Watanabe. You have been most punctual in your comments. Thank you so much for your cooperation. When it comes to China and Taiwan, we've been focused on the domestic situation in Taiwan, their awareness of the situation. I think this is trending toward a very positive direction. And also, as was just mentioned by Dr. Watanabe, with regard to the domestic situation in the U.S. and the resolve on the part of the administration of Mr. Biden, you talked about the backdrop as to why this resolve is being enhanced. Now, for the attendants, we would like to inform you again. If you have any questions or comments, please utilize the chat function on the screen. And please, you can submit your comments and questions at any given time. We are monitoring your questions and comments as they come in. We'd like to take them up later on. Then next, we'd like to go on to Professor Nagashima. If you could give us your insight from the military perspective. And also, we've been talking about the Taiwan Straits in a very broad terms. But what about the periphery of Taiwan Straits? If you could focus on that, I would appreciate it. The floor is yours.
Thank you. On my part, I would like to talk about the military aspect of Taiwan contingency. As you know very well, there is an overwhelmingly large difference between the military strength of China and Taiwan in terms of defense budget. China spends about 22.6 trillion yen, 4 times larger of Japanese, and Taiwan's budget is about 1.4 trillion yen. Total force is 2.04 million and 170,000 fighters, 1,000 versus Taiwan 300. Overwhelmingly large difference. But in case of contingency, it's not that all force can be devoted by PLA to the Taiwan's invasion because of the geopolitical situation of China. China is bigger than Japan by 25 times larger. Continental country shares border with 14 countries. So when making a military action, U.S. force in this region, China, Japan, and our case activities should be taking into consideration some kind of a reserve need to be kept within PLA. And for the past 10-year period, defense budget grew by 2.3 times in China. Over 30 years, more than 42 times larger. It's been modernized so that PLA is preparing for any eventuality, that's for sure. So what happens when the actually Taiwan contingency occurs in terms of a military scenario? It's not only a matter of a use of a military force occupying the Taiwan territory and the CCP would rule Taiwan, which means that it's not only a kinetic activity of PLA, but in non-military aspect, one should think about the total operation in thinking about the big picture. The characteristic of the modern war is different from a traditional way of a war. It will not be a large-scale crossfire. Internationally, interdependencies are progressing socially and politically. People cannot tolerate the big damage to be done by the war. No more war of attrition or destruction. Victimization need to be avoided at all means. International environment is changing. Gray zone is appearing. Peace, no war. Cyber attack, terrorist attack, sabotage, deceit, and misinformation, hybrid threat in a blended manner will be used. And in the final analysis, it will be linked to the use of military power in the end, but a hybrid threat plays a big role in the modern warfare. In fact, in 2008, Russia made a military aggression into Georgia, and Georgia's government media bank systems was, first of all, attacked, inclusive a cyber attack in advance. Social environment became unstable, confusion had taken place, then it linked to the military activity using tanks and the fighters. The same thing had happened in Crimea annexation back in 2014. It has become much more sophisticated and calculated hybrid war. So this is the asymmetric type of war. The victim from combat will be kept minimum over a short period of time. The operation will be finished so that it will be free from hard criticism from the international community. So this is in line with China's informatized war, like sabotage and friction. China learned a great deal from Russia in terms of the logistics, and this is a hybrid way of fighting, and it can be applicable to the Taiwan contingency. What will be the final objective of Taiwan aggression? That is a restoration of great Chinese people, place Taiwan under CCP rule. It's not just a punitive attack, nor the escalation into war triggered by accident. So meticulous preparation will be made, and it's inevitable that hybrid war methodology will be used. And the illegal activities and attack will begin from cyberspace and the outer space, first of all. The civilian function of Taiwan will be blocked, interdicted, and neutralized, making the security situation very unstable and perturb the defense of Taiwan. Not only Taiwan, but U.S. forces, Japan and ROK, they may become a target of a hybrid attack by China. And by non-kinetic attack and so forth, all at once, artificial satellite stop functioning, power transport financing system being disrupted, and SNS and other media will carry misinformation. The large-scale outage might occur in a prolonged fashion. Transport will not function, financial system disrupt, and so forth. Civilians' livelihood will be confused over a long time. That will result in the worsening of the security and the confusion domestically, and impact military activities dependent on the civilian infrastructure. As a result of a new hybrid attack, the operation will not function well. hamper the defense system and posture. And then, all of a sudden, China began the military activities. And in the new domain, many things may occur. Would it be due to the accident or intended? It's hard to judge the intent, whether it's an accident or intended. And it can be a part of a paralysis operation of China PLA. In 2015, the Strategic Support Force was launched, covering cyberspace and electromagnetic wave, so that PLA has lots of capacity to exert their capability to the utmost. And the attack on the new domain would just be enlarged, as if it goes on the spiral staircase, and it can really accelerate it and regain force and gather force and push physical military operation. So resilience will be a very important point for the countermeasure. Resilience needs to be assured. The severe attack on new domain can be responded to if a task and functions can be continued, if there is a mechanism enabling the continuity of the function as a state in civilians' livelihood. Even if a critical infrastructure may go dysfunction, it can be restored immediately. That is a resilience, and that kind of social system has to be put into place. And military might attack on the civilian activities and other delayed timing, also attack on the command and control system, communication system, but interoperability and the alternative nature can be assured, then these attacks can be
Thank you very much, Professor Nagashima, for your presentation. You have all been very punctual, all of you. We appreciate it. And as a moderator, I'm very grateful for kind cooperation. Going forward, we hope to take as long discussion period as much as possible. In particular, Professor Nagashima, you talked about the situation pertaining to Georgia and Crimea, and how hybrid strategies were taken with regard to annexation of Crimea. Russia, I would imagine, had no victims at all, and they were able to annex Crimea without any such sacrifice. This is very 19th century type of an approach. It's very scary that such a 19th century approach was successful. I hope that we'll be able to deepen a discussion on our point later on. The next, I would like to turn to the final speaker, Dr. Nakamura, please. Dr. Nakamura, you will focus on legal. You are an expert in legal framework, so if you could focus on the legal perspective with regard to security, and talk about your views about the Taiwan crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yamaguchi. We just heard from 3 people speak, talking about politics, diplomacy, and the military aspect. So Mr. Yamaguchi had just introduced that from myself, I would like to talk about Taiwan Contingency from the aspect of Japanese legislation. Well, currently, under the pandemic, we have a big flow of people, infections are rising in number, but we hadn't taken the mandatory lockdown measure in Japan as opposed to other countries. So inclusive of constitution and so forth, the much respect is given to human rights, and that follows on the work of SCAF forces after the end of war. So measures Japan can take is based on the individual law specific to cause and character of a situation, and applications are limited. And legislation is made normally only when actual situation occur. But only exception is when it pertains to the peace and security of Japan. This is a situation response legislation, mainly important influence situation and armored attack situation. So this situation has not occurred yet, but this is in preparation for it when those situations really might occur. That's a design. But it wasn't like not like that always. It dates back to the DPRK crisis back in 93 and 94. That is a precursor. If you look at the evolution of a Japanese security policy during the Cold War, it was based on the individual right of defense exercising, try to protect Japan from Soviet attack from north. But Cold War had occurred, and as a result of the in Korean Peninsula and Taiwan situation occurring in this region might come over to hit Japan. And in March 1993, DPRK left NPT, and in May, test-fired ballistic missile, and in the April the following year declared to leave IAEA. And the Clinton administration then decided to be ready to wage limited military attack on DPRK when it was inevitable. And U.S. asked Japan then what it could do to support the United States. Time and again, U.S. asked that question to Japan. However, during that time in Japan, there was no legislation available for supporting the United States. Then cabinet in Japan couldn't but to have a extrajudiciary type of activities. But in the end, President Carter visited DPRK, so the whole thing was settled. But it was a lesson learned by Japan. So in 1996, Hashimoto Clinton made an agreement. In the following year of 97, Japan-US guideline was revised, and the emergency at the periphery was added. And in the following year of 1999, the emergency at the periphery law was legislated in Japan. And as a result of this legislation during the peacetime, there was a Japan-US joint activities, but under which it was not anticipated for Japan to support US in war. But possibilities that emerged as a result of the new legislation. Guideline was revised, and emergency at periphery law was made. So it became a precursor, and it had led to the creation of a new framework for Japan-US joint action. On the other hand, during which time use of force was based on the individual right to defense exercised by Japan. But fast forward to now, then the security situation had changed drastically, became more tense. So in order to protect the peace and security of Japan, we have to have a global, as mentioned by Mr. Nagashima, cyber attack and so forth. Attack on new domain needs to be also responded to. So this is a changes occurring. So in 2015, once again, Japan-US guideline was once again revised and enacted peace and security legislation, which partially allowed for the limited right to collective defense for Japan. So what could SDF do in time of Taiwan contingency? In foreign countries, activities of military forces are covered cross-sectoral way from peacetime to wartime. But in case of SDF's activities, it's based on the category and power, based on the individual law, which is a positivist method. So whenever situation would occur in terms of peace and security of Japan, the actions will be categorized based on the category of the situation. This is a situation response legislation. In case of Taiwan contingency, depending on situation, important influence situation, survival threatening situation, armed attack situations, all the actions will be framed by the situation or a category. During the peacetime in the East China Sea, Japan and US is conducting business vigilance and surveillance, sharing the information all the time. and not only between Japan and US in these waters, as well as in Pacific, there is UK, France, Australia, and Canada, where joint exercises are being conducted from time to time. The strengthened activities would have a significance as a FDO, flexible deterrence option for China. On the other hand, if the situation becomes tense in the areas around Taiwan, U.S. might deploy forces around Taiwan. If it is prolonged, then for the surveillance in East China Sea, SDF will come and supplement vigilance and surveillance activities. And if the deployment of military force is prolonged, then the supply support will be needed on the sea. So using Okinawa as a supply base, Japanese SDF may provide support to U.S. And in order to do that, there is a declaration needed for important influence situation. And if it evolves into the armed crossfire between U.S. and China, then of course the important influence situation need to be declared by Japan. So then the U.S., who is a direct party to conflict, can receive support from Japan. But under the important influence situation, SDF cannot go to the support of U.S. At a place of combat. So only supply support can be given in faraway places and cannot defend the U.S. forces. Because ground for that is SDF law Article 95.2. It said that it excludes the activities in the combat area for SDF. So if U.S. is involved in combat, then of course, attack on the U.S. forces will be regarded as a combat attack, so SDF cannot come to support. But in case of China's missile, anti-ship missile threat, then SDF to provide missile protection support will become very important. If such a protection needed, then immediately survival threatening situation need to be declared to assist the U.S. And mainly U.S. forces come from Okinawa, Yokosuka, and Sasebo to Taiwan. And not only U.S. bases, but important rear base within Japan, such as port, might become a target of attack by China. In such cases, the armed attack is being anticipated. Then that is a time when anticipated armed attack situation will be declared and issue defense convocation order or standby order for deployment. If it is imminent, then of course defense deployment order will be ordered with the declaration of armed attack situation. And exercise individual right to self-defense. So there is a framework of a situation being discussed mainly inside Japan, but there's one more important point to be considered. In 1994, SDF law was revised, and which pertains to the transport of Japanese nationals abroad. Non-combatant transport operation, it is for short known as NEO. And when I was in the United States, they always said NEO, NEO. What was NEO? Then it was this. So according to the current guideline, it's for the non-combatant evacuation activities. In 1997, there was a guideline. This was one of the areas for joint study. And in 2015, guideline was revised, and it had become formally an item for cooperation. So who can be transported will be not only Japanese national, but other countries' nationals overseas. And 4 cases of transport had taken place so far. And Japanese persons transport was done under SDF law, And in Yemen, 96 people, Germany, France, Jordan, and Italy. These people were evacuated by using the military plane, military craft. In Albania, the SDF was not ready, not in time, so that including Japanese 10 people, about 530 people in total, inclusive of German people, were transported to Cologne in Germany. And 10 German nationals were included in that transport operation. So in case of Taiwan emergency for transporting Japanese people, at the time of Taiwan Strait crisis back in 96, then Prime Minister Hashimoto instructed the examination into the transport of Japanese national. As of May, about 42,000 Japanese people are living in Taiwan. In case of Albania crisis and so forth, the Europe has geographical restrictions and so forth. It's very hard to send the transporter so that Japan and US might request a support or come up with a request to Japan and the United States for transiting European nationals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakamura. You talked about security legislation, and also you also talked about the periphery emergency at periphery law situation. These are very challenging, and just reading the words alone does not conjure image, but you give a concrete, very straightforward presentation. I really appreciate that. You also mentioned FDO, flexible deterrence option. It's short for flexible deterrent option. So when something is likely to occur, our response needs to be made. We need to project that possible response and preparedness. And you need to communicate your willingness to defend in order to enhance deterrence. So it's like a cat putting with the hair standing on. And you gave a very broad-ranging explanation about the support. Well, we have sufficient time left for discussion, so I would like to have panel discussion among the panelists at this juncture. Allow me to start. So in the reverse order, I would like to ask one or two questions, comments as well as questions to each of the panelists, and ask them to respond to those questions and comments. So allow me to first begin with Dr. Nakamura. You gave a very straightforward presentation, sir. During the 1990s, we had the U.S.-Japan alliance redefinition period, and at that time, the legislation framework began to be developed, and various systems were introduced as a result. And also, we've had the crisis management system, and also in the 2010s, the peace and security legislation were introduced in Japan. So let's assume, without these legislative frameworks in place, if we were to go back to 1992 or 1993, and if we were to face Taiwan Strait situation and crisis at that time, it's very scary to consider that situation. But so much has become possible in comparison. Can you highlight what became possible as a result of the changes after 1992? I would appreciate it, Dr. Nakamura. And I will ask each of the panelists for their comments and questions. And after that, we will ask for your response. Next, Dr. Nagashima. You indicated that it's very challenging. Military taking away Taiwan from. You talked about how it's difficult for China to military take away Taiwan. You talked about some of the challenges. Also, I was with the Ground Self-Defense Force myself, and I know that Taiwan forces are very robust. I have that impression. So, if I may also add my comment, for one thing, in terms of the land area, the forces deployed against the land. For example, in the case of China, it's 2.3 million. If you divide by the area, then actually the level is not that high. In the case of Taiwan, though, you find that for each square kilometer, you have 4 or 5 military personnel stationed. So in the case of Korean Peninsula, in a very small land, 1.3 million North Korean forces and 600,000 forces in South Korea. So you have 2 million forces on Korean Peninsula. Now, so on a per kilometer basis, in the case of North Korea, it's only about 9. In the case of South Korea, it's only 6 per square kilometer. In the case of Taiwan, it's 4 or 5 per square kilometer. So it's quite so it's a very high level, and also it's landlocked. If you go through a non-combat area, you cannot come to them. You cannot reach the area. It's across the ocean. It's not landlocked, and you have 160,000 elite forces awaiting you. So therefore, if you use the conventional method, you will not be able to take Taiwan. And also, more than a decade ago, I was concerned about a certain situation. In the past, with regard to Taiwan military forces, compared against PLA, they were much modernized. But in comparison, in China, was large in scale at that time. But in terms of the defense expenditure per personnel, actually per capita defense expenditure was much higher in Taiwan. But 15 to 16 years ago, this was overtaken by China. And actually, the gap was twofold. So we had a very rich Chinese military force at that time. But then, if you look at the recent numbers, actually, this situation reverted once again. In the case of China, on a per capita basis, they have $90,000 per each military force. In the case of Taiwan, the per capita basis, 70,000 military expenditure per one military officer. So therefore, we still have very elite forces in Taiwan with sufficient financial backing. In the case of Japan, it's at $200,000, $70,000 for each South Korean personnel. So we could say that the military forces are at a very high level with regard to the financial backing. So my question to Dr. Nagashima is as follows. You talked about the degree of modernization. So you could have air-to-air power, but the air-to-air balance is a very critical factor. So therefore, in the case of the latest fighter plane, the 5th generation fighter planes, can you talk about the numbers of these fighter planes and also the degree of development of these fighter planes? If you could just share that with us, I would appreciate it. That's a question to Dr. Nagashima. The next question to Dr. Watanabe. You gave a very encouraging presentation about Mr. Biden, how under Biden the alliance is now being emphasized. And also with regard to U.S.-China relations, because it's challenging, the Asia commitment to Asia has become stronger. So in turn, there is a stronger U.S. commitment to Taiwan. That is my understanding of your comment. So that may be the case. But if you look back a while back, though, under Trump administration, though, he talked about America first, and he only focused on America. And he was not very... he did not turn his eye on alliance. He did not commit much to the alliance. So that being the case, going forward, over the short term or over the medium term, the U.S. policy, how will it evolve? Is there possibility that the pendulum could swing to on the other end of the spectrum? I would appreciate your sharing with us the risk of the U.S. pendulum swinging once again. Now, Dr. Matsuda, I asked the same question in a different study group to you, Dr. Matsuda. When it comes to the military clash between China and Taiwan, I asked you to highlight some conditions in order to prevent such clashes. The first is robust U.S.-Japan alliance. Also, the people of Taiwan and the resolve on the part of the Taiwanese people to defend Taiwan is also important if we are to prevent any clashes, military clashes between China and Taiwan. When Premier Tsai first took office, Taiwan was backed into a corner. And there was a film called No Way Out. And very much like that movie, there was a very gloomy environment in Taiwan at a given time. So the resolve on the part of the Taiwan people should not waver. Is there a situation that could actually undermine the resolve on the part of the Taiwanese public? And if there's, what potential situations are likely? So let me start with Dr. Nakamura first.
Well, thank you for the question. Well, during the 1990s, or first of all, in 97, the guideline was revised, but prior to that, the guideline was revised, and also once again in 2015, guideline was once again revised, and things that were not impossible became possible. Let's review that. Back in 97, guideline, or prior to that, as I said to you before, for the 93, 94, there was a DPRK crisis, and initially, the United States thought about options, and there was a import ban embargo by UN blocking the transport of vessels in and out of DPRK. Quarantine in Cuba was a sort of a similar situation. Objective was different, but initially they attempted to do that, but in terms of international law, UN resolution was needed, but US was adamant in doing it, even without UN Security Council resolution. So in Taiwan, if activities is prolonged, then the on the ocean supply shipment will be needed, and they sought Japanese assistance on this, and thought about what further Japan can do in terms of in time of armed conflict, and guideline was revised in the way that the U.S. had preferred. But it was not enough for. That is why Japan enacted emergency at periphery law, and based on that, the U.S. engaged in war will be the target to which Japan can also provide assistance. So that was a major change made. That's first thing. And also after the end of a Cold War, if you look at the security situation of international community, it really evolved quickly. So it was okay only to defend Japan initially, but Cold War was ended, and we needed to look over to the situation at the periphery. And now, more global perspective need to be applied. Japan also have to think about what international contribution Japan can do. That is why in 2015, once again, guideline was revised to be followed by the legislation of peace and security law. So what was most epoch-making is that there was a constitution made, and constitution was put into place and rearmed, and the SDF was formed. But the exercising of collective right of defense was also able to be exercised as a result of the enactment of new law of peace and security for Japan. So Japan had broadened what you can do, and there is a ground for legislation for doing that. Did I answer your question?
Thank you very much. Dr. Nagashima, please.
Well, thank you for the question. Mr. Yamaguchi asked me a question, and I would like to answer the question. First of all, of course, you talked about fifth generation aircraft. I would like to answer that part. I didn't mention this before, but military speaking, what are the operations that is possible? I would like to talk about that as well. So first of all, fifth generation aircraft, it's a stealth, like F-35, air defense forces using, and it's a hard. So those fighters will not appear on the radar. But it's not only that. There is a sensor capability, networking capability aboard fifth generation aircraft. It's a highly sophisticated. Combat system is much more sophisticated with a fifth generation fighter. For China, they have a J-20 domestically made fighter. In 2017, first operation had begun, and presently it's put into the unit in greater number. and 1,000 fighters I mentioned in China. And the mainstay is the previous generation, fourth generation or 4.5 generation fighters are the mainstay. But for PLA, it will be replaced quickly with the fifth generation fighters. However, what is frightening is that I'm talking about the hardware. But I'm much more afraid of the next thing, what could happen in the next war or next stage. So generally, there is a technology evolving like AI and the UAV, and one can detect the target, and the self-reliant weapon system is being developed much more quickly. The private sector is going ahead, and quantum can come in as a computing and the biotechnology combined into the military technology. It's really frightening what can occur. Totally different mode of war might happen. Look at China, they are looking at the fusion between military and civilian, military-civilian fusion. So they are working in combined form very aggressively. Just for example, look at the COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan. What happened in China? Through the TV screen, I felt very much frightened because there's infected people, total lockdown of the region, and the drone was used, and big data was used to control people, and QR code is being used, and also the facial recognition and so forth used to put a limit to the spread of the infection. So this can be applied to the military field, which is quite frightening how far you can go. So social deployment is going on the technology. So it might be that a totally different mode of war can happen in future. So the principle is to minimize the damage and minimize the area of war. From a mainland, the ballistic missile and the cruise missile can be fired at the target of important critical information area of opponent. Then comes the actual landing by PLA soldiers, but there is going to be one more stage to be added. Totally unmanned UAV can be used in large number, or UUV, unmanned submersibles. And unmanned vehicle would wage attack on the manned bases and so forth. And afterwards, physical landing can take place by PLA soldiers. Not only US, but Japan also has to be ready to counter that kind of new mode of attack.
Thank you very much. Dr. Watanabe, please.
Well, thank you. You asked the commitment by United States on Taiwan about 10 years ago. I wrote a book, Reverse of U.S. and China in 2025. Why is it that U.S. frequently change their policy on Taiwan? I explained that in my book. I can name an example. There was a Papa Bush era. There was a Tiananmen incident which had occurred and took a hardline stance vis-à-vis China. But after that, re-engagement of China into international community was attempted. And Clinton administration was very critical about that. The most favored country, most favored nation treatment and human rights were linked under Clinton administration. But under Clinton administration, China was allowed to join WTO, no linkage to the human rights then. The son, Bush, came and became hardline against China, but 9/11 incident had occurred and allied or cooperated better with China and so forth. So it goes back and forth. So you asked me a very apt question. frequent change on the part of U.S. for Taiwan policy and Chinese policy. The reason why it changed so frequently vis-a-vis China is that what is more serious than China is a concern. For example, maybe under Clinton administration, much bigger economic benefit to be gained from China than human rights. And for the ambush, of course, China was a threat, but 9/11 terrorist incident was much more threatening and serious. Then U.S. might strike a deal with China, but not at the risk of Taiwan or victimizing at the cost of Taiwan, because if you look at China and the United States, China's military power is strengthening, and the U.S. is recognizing that China's military force will become really threatening against the United States. And U.S. would recognize that just before. During the early part of Obama administration, there was a G2 theory going on. G2 meaning China and the United States. So the half of the Pacific will be controlled by U.S. and the other half will be controlled by China and so forth. If China would not challenge the United States, then maybe U.S. thought U.S. can cooperate with China on global agenda like climate change. So when it comes to climate change, of course, it can be an area where U.S. can cooperate with China. But U.S. will not give up on their security front. So that is a big difference now and then between United States and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, I would like to invite Dr. Matsuda.
Thank you. So China using force or forcefully have a peaceful unification by use of force. Dysfunction of Japan-U.S. alliance, and Taiwan will lose the intent to rebel against China and so forth. But Taiwanese people are willing to rebel against China for the past 2 years. It reached the highest level. It made a news. So do you resist if China would attack Taiwan? Then most of the Taiwanese people said yes, they will resist. So if you ask the same question to Japan, the answer will be 5 to 6%. But Taiwanese tend to feel isolated from the rest of the world because China is working behind the sea, like WHO, the World Health Assembly, rejecting Taiwan to take part, and China is blocking Taiwan to get hands on the vaccine supply and so forth, and saying that take Chinese-made vaccine, and saying that to Taiwan, but Taiwanese people felt that they are isolated, they are taken advantage of by China. So always we have to show with action that the rest of the world is not abandoning Taiwanese people, so that Taiwan people can get the reassurance that they are not being isolated. Japan made a vaccine assistance on June the 4th, which was very much appreciated. Japan will not sell arms to Taiwan. U.S. would sell arms to Taiwan. For the self-defense of Taiwan, it will be strengthened. It's a special war ground. So rather than fighting at full force, the Taiwan can raise its asymmetry type of military strength. And joint training cannot take place in Taiwan, so it can take place instead in U.S. territory and so forth. For by and by, U.S. can increase its assistance to Taiwan, which would be helpful for Taiwanese people to feel less isolated, and also Taiwan people can strengthen their intent to rebel.
Thank you very much. You cited the example of vaccine support. In Japan, in order to enhance the resolve on the part of the Taiwanese people, there's much the Japanese can do. Thank you for pointing that out to us. So in the remaining 10 minutes or so, let us take a look at the questions and comments from the participants. We received many questions from the participants. I'm afraid we cannot take up all the questions, unfortunately. But let me highlight several questions to our panelists. So the first point relates to the possibility of pushing China into a corner. For example, the domestic the inequities, the excessive debt, and the changing demographics, there are domestic challenges faced by China. And because they are faced with difficulties domestically, they're taking actions abroad. That's a very conventional method. The second question, unless Kuomintang changes, the Taiwanese, they cannot be viable in the domestic Taiwanese political situation. So therefore, how can I put it? Becoming fruitful for the Communist Party in Taiwan. If Kuomintang no longer serves as a bridge between the Chinese Communist Party and the Taiwanese people, then wouldn't that lead to a situation where the Chinese would take a more hardline policy vis-a-vis Taiwan because of the weakening of Kuomintang? Dr. Matsuda, and also Dr. Watanabe and other panelists, would you like to take these two questions up, please? Thank you.
Then can I answering the first question? Because of the time constraints, I skipped that before. Sorry about that. If you think about everything, you have to think about profit and losses, then China will not make an armed invasion. But if they are driven to the corner and be pressed to show their strength and presence, and lead not that to the independence of Taiwan, and if they like to drive a wedge against that kind of a trend, then of course there is a likelihood that China might exert its force if they are driven really into the corner. However, as far as the current situation goes, under the Tsai Ing-wen, of course they are avoiding being provocative, and the Biden administration is highly predictable as opposed to the Trump administration. So they have not driven China to the extreme extent or extreme corner. Well, going on to the question, there is an internal contradiction. What to do about it? If you look at the overseas activities of China, like diversionary war theory, they seldom take that kind of approach, really. Of course, they are faced with an intolerable provocation, then that would be the way to go, but they wouldn't do that normally. It's good for us to talk about many things, but we should not be too vocal about it or too public. Well, Chinese leadership must know how serious Japan and US are, but we should not be too vocal about it in a public forum. So very quietly, it's better for us to build deterrence. And secondly, looking at KMT is very difficult to be changed. It has to do with the electoral system of Taiwan. In region, they still have support for KMT, like in case of Japan, similar here. That there is a middle-size constituency system, and in case of KMT, they have a 40% support, so they can get seats in middle-size district. but a presidential election, legislative election, the seat is only one available for each district and so it's difficult for KMT to gain force. So they might have a less central force, but they still have a big regional support. And DPP also have lots of shortcomings at the same time. So sometimes people wouldn't like the railroad stance of DPP. So KMT might get a disillusion or some fantasy that they can win because they are stronger on the regional side. So it will take time for KMT to change. But they call themselves China KMT, but they can become Taiwan KMT. If that happens, then of course China will feel very much hopeless about the eventual unification. Thank you. And of course, sometimes to resolve the internal contradiction, they may divert the attention away from domestic and go to international. But if weak China goes out to external world, then that might not be a good thing. Look at the Biden administration. The President Biden made a speech at the Congress and said that, look, we are talking with Xi Jinping, that China has no wish to have a war against the United States and so forth. And it goes vice versa. And it's for Japan and the United States and so forth, but it always important for us to maintain the communication channel with China. But I think you asked me a very important question.
Thank you very much. We have roughly 4 minutes remaining, so this will be the final question of the session, perhaps. So there are questions from 2 speakers, but these are very essential questions. So in the third version of the 1972 of the Japan-China political statement, they explain that Taiwan is an inseparable part of the Chinese territory, and the Japanese government understands there is such a wording in the communique. So therefore, the other question is this. So unification of Taiwan through military forces. China will argue that this is the domestic issue. If that is the case, what argument can be put forward to counter the situation? And what will the arguments taken by Japanese government and self-defense force? And what about the legal position that could be taken against such a backdrop? Dr. Matsuda, Dr. Nagashima, and Dr. Nakamura, if you could respond to this question, please, I would appreciate it.
About the joint statement, communique. Taiwan is a part of China, and Japan respect that and understand that, and Article 8 of Potsdam Declaration is being upheld by Japan. So what can be derived here is that Japan does not support the independence of Taiwan. However, there's a security treaty between Japan and the United States, and there is Article 6 upholding the peace in the Northeast Asia. And there is a Taiwan relations law of the United States and so forth. There is a loophole here. So we have emergency and periphery legislation in Japan and so forth for the peace and security of Japan, how much of it is being threatened by the Taiwanese situation. And that will determine whether SDF can provide assistance to United States and to what extent. So to defend Taiwan or exercise a collective right to defense, or it's not that SDF will go out to the defense of Taiwan directly or not, no. There is a high seas there around Taiwan, then if a attack occurs in that area, and if it is highly linked to the peace and security of Japan, then of course Japan can, in such circumstances, can assist the U.S.
Yes, I think this outlines and expresses your rich practical experience. You were indeed a member of the central government. Thanks for the comment. Dr. Nagashima, would you like to respond? And also Dr. Nagashima, very briefly, please. Thank you.
Yes. When it comes to this issue, it is highly linked to the activities of Japan from China's point of view. In case of Taiwan contingency, there is a U.S. and Japan involved there. Alliance relationship, and China feels they have to be prepared, and there's a senkaku issue involved and so forth, so that these things need to be responded to, having a intent that they are direct party. Thank you. So for the legislation related matter about the survival threatening situation, the other countries are having a close link to Japan, then that would constitute the situation. So if what about Japan exercising a collective right to self-defense in case of Taiwan? Within the diet, the question was raised from the opposition party. So when we say other countries, there are countries included with whom no diplomatic relations have been established, like Taiwan and Palestine, for example. So specific questions have been asked by opposition party, and the government had responded by saying that those countries where Japan does not establish diplomatic relations, it's included, but in terms of the region, always what region is included in the legislation is asked.
Thank you so much. Under the constraint of 1 hour and a half, you gave us very concrete insight, all of you. At the same time, how can I put it? You gave us issues of concern. You also outlined actions that need to be taken. And I think what needs to be done going forward has become very clear. I'm afraid we're not able to respond to all the questions that were put forward. But we were able to have very profound discussions, and I'm sure that this will be a great basis for us to further deepen discussions going forward. So it was an excellent webinar, if I may praise our own program. So with this, we'd like to conclude the third security seminar, the Japanese response to a Taiwan crisis. We'd like to end the seminar. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I would like to thank all the panelists. I would like to thank all of you who have taken part and who have asked questions. Also, with regard to the panelists, they have also submitted papers to our satellite site, International Information Network Analysis, or IINA for short. Their publications are available at the satellite site as well. So if you're interested, we hope that you will take a look at that. You can check the URL on the YouTube comment section. You'll be able to access the web page through this URL. Thank you once again for your participation. Thank you very much.